The forest was alive, but not in a way that brought comfort. The leaves whispered secrets I couldn't hear, rustling in the soft wind that carried an uneasy chill. The sun barely peeked through the thick canopy of trees, and each step I took felt like it led deeper into something unknown. This trip wasn't my idea. It was Lucas's. "Come on, Sophie," he had said, flashing his usual grin. "It'll be fun, just a simple hike, some fresh air. We'll forget about everything for a while." And I had agreed. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed to escape. We were a group of 4. Lucas, my best friend, who always had a knack for dragging me into his wild ideas. Emma, the adventurous one, who seemed fearless no matter what we faced. Then there was Josh, the quiet one, who tagged along more for Emma's sake than his own. And then there was me, Sophie, the planner, the careful one, the one who didn't belong in a place like this. But I came anyway. The first few hours were fine. The trail was well marked and the weather was kind. Emma was ahead, laughing as Lucas tried to keep up with her. Josh stayed close to me, his silence a welcome contrast to their constant chatter. But something shifted when we veered off the main path. Lucas had spotted something, a shortcut, he called it. "Just trust me," he said, his grin a little too confident. "This'll take us straight to the mountain view." I hesitated. "Are you sure? It doesn't look like anyone's been this way in years." "It's fine, Sophie," Emma chimed in. "Don't be such a worrier." So we followed him. The trees grew denser. The sunlight dimmed, and that uneasy feeling I'd had since the start of the trip began to grow. By the time we reached the first clearing, it was clear we were lost. Lucas tried to play it cool, pulling out a map he barely knew how to read. Emma rolled her eyes but didn't say anything. Josh stayed quiet, his gaze flickering between the trees as if he were expecting something or someone to appear. "We'll figure it out," Lucas said, his voice steady but his hands not. But I wasn't so sure. The first sign of trouble came just before sunset. We stumbled across an old wooden bridge, its planks worn and unstable. "Do we cross it?" Emma asked, her voice tinged with hesitation for the first time. Lucas nodded. "It's the only way forward." I stepped back, my heart racing. What if it's not safe? What if it breaks? "It'll be fine," Lucas said, already stepping onto the first plank. I watched as he made his way across, his footsteps careful but confident. Emma followed, then Josh. And then it was my turn. The first step was fine. So was the second. But halfway across, the wood beneath me groaned, a low, haunting sound that froze me in place. "Keep going!" Lucas called from the other side, his voice distant against the growing wind. I took another step. The plank cracked. I screamed, grabbing onto the rope railing as my foot slipped through the gap. "Sophie!" Lucas shouted, running back toward me. His hand reached out, steadying me as I pulled myself back onto the bridge. My heart was pounding so loud I couldn't hear anything else. See, you're fine, he said, his voice calm despite the fear in his eyes. But I didn't feel fine. That night, we set up camp in another clearing. The fire crackled weakly, casting long shadows against the surrounding trees. Lucas tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but even Emma wasn't laughing anymore. We all felt pit, that strange, oppressive presence in the air. It's just a forest, Josh said finally, breaking his silence. There's nothing here. But his words didn't convince any of us. I barely slept that night. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch felt magnified in the darkness. At some point, I thought I heard footsteps. Soft, deliberate, too heavy to belong to an animal. I held my breath, my eyes wide open as I stared at the tent walls, waiting for something or someone to appear. But nothing did. The next morning, things got worse. Lucas woke us early, insisting we keep moving before the weather turned. Which way do we go? I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. He pointed toward the thickest part of the forest. That way. How do you know? Emma asked, her tone sharp. I just do, he snapped. I didn't argue. I didn't have the energy to. By midday, we came across something that stopped us all in our tracks. A structure. It was old, almost ancient, made of stone and covered in moss. At first it looked like a monument, but as we got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. A shrine. Carvings covered the stone surface, depicting strange, twisted figures. What is this? Emma whispered, her voice blending into the stone and covered in moss. At first it looked like a monument, but as we got closer, I realized it was a statue to Mariah in which a god holding the clouds wood-poled. Let's keep moving, Josh said quickly, his eyes darting around the clearing. Lucas, I said, stepping closer to him. He didn't respond. The sound came suddenly. A low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from everywhere at once. We all froze. What was that? Emma asked, her voice shaking. Nobody answered. The forest seemed to close in around us as we ran, the trees blurring together in a haze of green and brown. I could hear something behind us, branches snapping, leaves rustling, heavy footsteps that didn't belong to any of us. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. By the time we stopped, my legs were burning and my lungs felt like they would burst. We had reached another clearing, this one darker, more sinister. What the hell was that? Emma demanded, her voice rising with panic. Lucas didn't answer. He was staring into the trees, his jaw clenched. We need to keep moving, he said finally. But I wasn't sure how much farther we could go. The clearing felt wrong. The air was heavier here, colder, as if the forest itself was trying to keep us trapped. Shadows danced across the ground, even though the sun was nowhere to be seen. I glanced at Lucas. His face was pale, his usual confidence replaced with something I hadn't seen before. Fear. "What now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled the map from his pack, studying it as if it might suddenly make sense. "We keep going," he said, finally, though his voice lacked conviction. Emma groaned, throwing her hands up. "Keep going where, Lucas? We're lost." "We're not lost," he snapped, though we all knew he was lying. Josh was the first to notice it. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his head tilting slightly, as if straining to catch a sound just out of reach. I listened, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, there was nothing, just the rustling of leaves in the wind. But then, a whisper, faint, unintelligible, but undeniably there. The whisper grew louder as we stood frozen, our breaths shallow, our bodies tense. It wasn't coming from one direction. It seemed to surround us, echoing off the trees like 1,000 voices speaking all at once. "What the hell is that?" Emma hissed, stepping closer to me. Nobody answered, and then, as suddenly as it started, the whispering stopped, and silence that followed was worse. "Let's move," Lucas said, his voice low and urgent. We didn't argue. The four of us trudged deeper into the forest, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of leaves and moss. The trees seemed to grow taller, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out what little light remained. My chest tightened with every step, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. "Do you think someone's out there?" I asked, breaking the silence. Lucas glanced back at me, his jaw tight. "It's just your imagination." But I knew he didn't believe that. We walked for what felt like hours. The forest seemed endless, every tree blending into the next. My legs ached, my throat was dry, and the weight of my pack felt unbearable. But then we saw it, another structure. This one was larger. This one was larger than the shrine we had found earlier, its stone walls covered in strange symbols. A door stood ajar, revealing nothing but darkness inside. "We're not going in there," Emma said firmly, crossing her arms. Lucas ignored her, stepping closer to the entrance. "Lucas, wait," I called, my stomach twisting in knots. But he didn't stop. The inside of the structure was colder than the forest, the air damp and heavy. Lucas shone his flashlight across the walls, revealing more carvings, figures that seemed to rise and twist in unnatural ways. "What is this place?" Josh muttered, his voice barely audible. Lucas didn't answer. He was focused on something at the center of the room, a large stone altar. As we stepped closer, I felt a chill run down my spine. The altar was stained dark, the markings around it more intricate and unsettling than anything we had seen so far. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. Lucas nodded, but as we turned to leave, a loud crash echoed through the room. We froze. "What was that?" Emma whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Before anyone could answer, the door slammed shut, flying twice. Panic set in immediately. "Lucas, what's happening?" I shouted, my voice echoing off the stone walls. "I don't know," he yelled back, fumbling with his flashlight. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the room with an almost deafening intensity. And then we saw it. A figure, tall, gaunt, and inhuman. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, its movements slow and deliberate. "Run!" Lucas screamed, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the door. The door creaked open just enough for us to slip through, and we ran as fast as we could, the sound of heavy footsteps close behind us. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but I didn't stop. None of us did. When we finally stopped, we were back in the clearing where we had camped the night before. Emma collapsed onto the ground, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Josh leaned against a tree, his face pale and his hands shaking. "What the hell was that?" Emma demanded, her voice breaking. Lucas didn't answer. He was staring at something on the ground, a trail of footprints leading away from the clearing. But they weren't ours. The realization hit us all at once. We weren't alone. Something, or someone, had been following us, watching us. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice fairly above a whisper. Lucas finally looked up, his expression grim. "We keep moving." The rest of the day was a blur. Every sound, every shadow felt like a threat. My mind raced with questions I didn't want to ask. Who or what was out there? And what did it want with us? By the time night fell, we were too exhausted to continue. We set up camp in another clearing, though none of us felt safe. The fire barely lit the darkness around us, the trees looming like silent sentinels. Lucas sat close to the flames, staring into them as if they held the answers we needed. Emma and Josh huddled together, their whispered conversation too quiet for me to hear. I sat alone, my back against a tree, my eyes scanning the shadows. And then I saw it. A figure stood just beyond the firelight. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I blinked, and it was gone. "Lucas," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Did you see that?" He looked up, his brow furrowing. "See what?" But I couldn't bring myself to answer, because deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever it wasn't going to stop. If you liked my story, please like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next story.